Welcome to day 14 of Cloud Techie. In this session, we are going to treat sensitivity labels as an information protection design and not just a label button inside Word or Outlook. The objective is to understand what the label represents, where it is stored, and how it is published to users, how protection is enforced, and why the design changes depending on whether you're labeling a file, an email, a meeting, a SharePoint site, a team, or a Power BI asset. By the end, you should be able to explain the difference between classification and protection, the difference between content labels and container labels, and the operational checks as an administrator should run when labels do not appear or do not behave as expected. The easiest way to understand sensitivity labels is to start with the problem they solve. In a Microsoft 365 environment, a document rarely stays inside one neat container. A finance file might start in SharePoint, get attached to an email, get downloaded for offline work, get shared in Teams, and eventually reach an external partner. Traditional permissions are still important, but they mainly protect the place where the content lives. A SharePoint permission protects the library or the site, but once the document is copied somewhere else, the original location control is no longer the whole story. Sensitivity labels solve that by attaching classification and, when configured, protection directly to the content or to the workspace. That is why Microsoft describes sensitivity labels as a way to classify and protect organizational data while preserving productivity and collaboration. The clean technical model is that a sensitivity label has two parts. The first part is classification, which is the human readable categories such as public, general, confidential, or highly confidential. The second part is the configuration behind the label, which defines what Microsoft 365 should enforce after the label is applied. A label can simply classify content without protection, or it can apply stronger controls such as encryption, usage restrictions, headers, footers, watermarks, or container settings for Teams and SharePoint. This distinction matters because the visible label name is not the security control by itself. The security outcome depends on the label configuration, the label policy that publishes it, and the workload where the label is being used. This is the most important architecture distinction in the whole topic. Microsoft uses the same sensitivity label concept across two different planes, and those planes are often confused. A content label applies to an item such as a document, an email, or a meeting. This is the plane where file encryption, email restrictions, content markings, and persistent protection live. A container label applies to a workspace such as SharePoint site, a Microsoft 365 group, or a team. This is the plane where you control collaboration settings such as privacy, external sharing, guest access, unmanaged device access, and other site or group behavior. The key point is that a container label protects the workspace boundary, but the items inside the workspace do not automatically inherit item-level label settings such as encryption and markings. If you remember only one design rule, remember that container protection and file protection are related, but they are not the same control. A sensitivity label becomes useful only after it goes through the full life cycle. First, you create the label in the Microsoft Purview and define what it means. Then, you configure the settings that match the scopes, such as encryption for files or privacy and sharing controls for a site. After that, you publish the label through a label policy, and the policy determines which users or groups can actually see the label in their apps. Once the user applies the label, the relevant Microsoft 365 service enforces the configured controls. After rollout, You review usage, audit events, and support tickets to see whether the design is working. This is why a label can exist in Purview and still not appear in Word, Outlook, Teams, or SharePoint for a specific user. Creation is not publishing, and publishing is not the same thing as correct policy targeting. When you create or edit a label in Microsoft Purview, scope is not a cosmetic choice. Scope decides which settings are available and where the label can be applied. If the label needs to protect Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, Meetings, Power BI, or supported Microsoft Fabric assets, you are working in the item and the data asset space. If the label needs to apply to Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites, Viva Engage communities, or Loop workspaces, you are working in the groups and site space. You can design a label that spans multiple scopes, but you should be clear about what the label means in each scope. Confidential as a file label might mean encryption and a folder, while confidential as a site label might mean private membership and restricted external sharing. Those are connected business ideas, but technically they are enforced by different services. From the user's perspective, sensitivity labels normally appear directly in the Office experience, for example, in the sensitivity bar or the sensitivity button in the ribbon. This is deliberate because adoption fails when classification is buried in menus that users never open. The important admin detail is that users do not automatically see every label created in the tenant. They see the labels that have been published to them through a label policy, and they must be signed in with their Microsoft 365 work or school account for the experience to work correctly. In production, when a user says they cannot see the confidential label, the first question is not whether the label exists. The first question is whether the publishing policy includes that user, their group, and the workload where they're trying to use it. A content label is the control you use when the data object itself needs classification or protection. Depending on the configuration, the label can apply encryption, define who can open the file, restrict actions such as copying, printing, or forwarding, and add visible markings such as headers, footers, and watermarks. This is where the label moves beyond a visual tag and becomes an enforcement point. Microsoft Learn describes this as protection that stays with the content, which is the key idea. If a protected file is downloaded or shared externally, the file can still require the right identity and usage rights before it opens. That is very different from relying only on the original SharePoint library permission. A container label is a control you use when the workspace itself needs a security posture. For example, a team that handles executive planning might need to be private, block, or limit external sharing. A SharePoint site that contains general internal content may have a different container label with looser collaboration rules. The design mistake is to assume that because the workspace is labeled confidential, every document inside it is also encrypted. Microsoft documentation is very explicit on this point. Items in those containers do not inherit item-level label settings, such as encryption and content markings, simply because the container has a label. If the file needs protection, they need content labels as well. A simple example makes the architecture easier to explain. Imagine a team called Finance Forecasting that should be restricted to finance leadership and selected executives. A container label can make the team private, influence external sharing, and apply the correct collaboration posture. Now imagine a workbook inside the team called Q4 Forecast. If that workbook is downloaded and emailed to a partner, the container label no longer controls the file. The workbook needs its own content label if the business wants encryption and persistent protection to follow the data. So the workspace label answers the question, who can collaborate in the space. The file label answers the question who can open the specific data object after it moves. A mature Microsoft 365 information protection design uses both questions. Cross-tenant behavior is a common source of confusion. When a protected file leaves your organization, the visible label name and the actual protection are not the same thing. An external recipient might not see your exact label name because their tenant does not share your label catalog, or because their application does not render your organization's label information in the same way. That does not automatically mean protection failed. If the label applied encryption through Microsoft Purview Information Protection, access is controlled by the rights assigned to that file. The recipient still needs the right identity and permissions to open or use the content. This is the difference between classification visibility and cryptographic enforcement. For security reviews, explain that the label name helps humans understand handling, while encryption and usage rights decide whether access is allowed. Content markings are useful because they make classification visible. A header can show confidential at the top of a document, a footer can include redistribution guidance, and a watermark can make the sensitivity obvious when a document is printed or displayed. This is valuable for user behavior, reviews, and handling expectations. The important design point is that markings are not the same thing as access control. A watermark does not stop from a user from opening a document if they already have access, and a footer does not prevent a file from being forwarded. Markings communicate the handling requirement, while encryption and usage rights enforce access. In a good design, markings and encryption support each other, but they're not substitutes for each other. SharePoint and OneDrive are important because many label files live there. Microsoft provides an option to enable sensitivity labels for supported Office files and PDFs in SharePoint and OneDrive. When enabled, users can see and apply labels in Offices for the web, and the services can be recognized and process supported label and encrypted files. That matters for collaboration features such as co-authoring, search, e-discovery, and data loss prevention. Without that support, encrypted files can become difficult for the service to inspect or process. The architect point is that labeling is not only a desktop Office feature. You need to design for how labeled files behave in SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams files, DLP, e-discovery, and the browser experience. This is also where file type support and existing label files need planning rather than assumption. Sensitivity labels also matter in Power BI and Microsoft Fabric because reporting is often where sensitive data becomes widely visible. A data set or a semantic model might contain confidential finance, HR, or patient adjacent operational data, and a report may expose that data to a broader audience. Microsoft Documents sensitivity label support for Power BI content and files, including scenarios where labels apply to reports and semantic models. From a solution architecture perspective, BI is not separate from information protection. Exports, analyze in Excel, Power BI desktop files, and PDF outputs are all forms of data movement. If the organization classifies the underlying data as confidential, the reporting layer should not become a classification blind spot. The most common support ticket after a sensitivity label rollout is that a user cannot see a label. The troubleshooting flow should be calm and systematic. First, confirm the label exists with get-label partial command. Second, confirm if it is published through a label policy with get-label policy. Third, confirm the user is actually in scope through direct assignment or group membership. Fourth, confirm the user is working in a supported client and is signed in with the correct Microsoft 365 work or school account. This matters because administrators often spend time recreating labels or changing protection settings when the real issue is policy assignment. A label is not visible because it exists. A label is visible because it is published to the right user for the right scope in the supported app. There are 4 mistakes that cause most sensitivity label deployments to disappoint. The first is assuming that a container label encrypts the file inside a SharePoint site or a team. It does not, and this misunderstanding creates a false sense of security. The second is publishing a container scope label and forgetting the entrust synchronization step, which leaves administrators wondering why the label is not available in Teams or site creation experiences. The third is creating too many labels. A complicated taxonomy looks impressive in a design document, but users will classify inconsistently if the choices are not obvious. The fourth is ignoring file format and PDF conversion behavior. Older formats in certain exports or print paths may not preserve labels for protection the way the business expects. These are the commands that matter for day-to-day admin and troubleshooting. Connect-IPP session connects to security and compliance partial, which is where the Purview label related commands are administrated. And get-label gives you the inventory of sensitivity labels and their configuration. And get-label policy tells you which labels are published and to whom, which is usually first useful when a user cannot see a label. And execute-Azure AD label sync synchronizes labels into Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft Teams sites, Microsoft 365 groups, or SharePoint sites. And for SC300 MS102 exams, the key is to explain the architecture clearly because a label classifies data and protection depends on the label configuration and the workload enforcing it. Content labels protect files, emails, meetings, and supported data assets, while container labels protect Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, and SharePoint sites. A container label does not automatically encrypt all files inside that workspace, so content labels are still required when the file themselves need persistent protection. A label policy controls who can see and apply labels, which means label visibility is a publishing problem before it is a creation problem. Microsoft Purview is a control plane where labels and policies are defined, while Office, Outlook, SharePoint, Teams, Power BI, and other services are the enforcement surfaces where users experience the design. The final mental model is simple and practical. You have to label the workspace, label the file, and govern both. The workspace label controls the collaboration boundaries such as team, group, or site. The file label controls the data object such as document, email, meeting, report, or exported file. The label policy controls who can see and apply each label, which is why publishing and scoping matters so much. Auditing and reporting confirm whether users are actually labeling the content and whether the organization is getting the protection intended. If you keep these 4 parts separate in your mind, sensitivity labels become much easier to design, troubleshoot, and explain to security, compliance, and leadership.